It was supposed to be a perfect afternoon. The kind you'd imagine in a postcard: blue skies, birds chirping, and the soft hum of the wind through the trees. The lake was calm, the water sparkling like glass. This was the life, my life. I was sitting on the porch, feet propped up on the railing, sipping my iced tea when I saw the trucks. They were there, parked at the edge of the lake with large tarps covering something bulky. At first, I didn't think much of it. There are always contractors and maintenance workers coming around to improve the place. We lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, fancy houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and a homeowners association, HOA, that treated our community like it was a five-star resort. We paid the HOA fees for the privilege of living here, after all. But this felt different. Normally, the HOA would send out a little email or leave a notice on your door when they planned to do something. But not this time. No heads up, no emails, just trucks rolling in and men in hazmat suits unloading things by the water. The sight caught my attention, but I shrugged it off. I had a million things to do, and frankly, my only concern at the time was whether or not the ice in my tea would melt before I finished it. The next day, I decided to take a stroll around the lake to clear my head. You know, just me and the calm, peaceful waters. As I walked, I noticed more trucks, more men in suits. The air was thick with a chemical smell that made my nose twitch. What was going on here? I approached the edge of the lake, and that's when I saw it. A large pile of barrels. They were stacked along the shoreline, some of them half open, and the labels, well, they weren't exactly friendly. I squinted, trying to read them. Corrosive, one said. Hazardous waste, another read. My stomach dropped. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't just improving the lake. They were poisoning it. I snapped a few pictures with my phone. I mean, I didn't know what I was dealing with exactly, but I knew enough to be worried. The more I looked, the worse it got. There were chemicals, dangerous chemicals, spilling into the lake, mixing with the water. I didn't have a fancy science degree, but I didn't need one to recognize the horror of it. You don't dump barrels of hazardous chemicals into a lake and call it improvement. Panic surged through me, but I pushed it down. First, I needed proof. I walked closer, careful not to get too close to the barrels because I didn't want to risk contaminating myself. I took more pictures. I filmed a short video. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I should have done more. I should have called the authorities right away. But instead, I did what any rational person would do in that moment. I called the HOA office. I dialed the number and in the calmest voice I could muster asked, "Hey, I noticed some trucks by the lake. What's going on?" The woman on the other end of the line was chipper, almost too chipper. "Oh, hi. Yes, we're just doing some maintenance work on the lake. Nothing to worry about, really. Just some improvements to the water quality." "Water quality?" I asked, my heart racing. "You're dumping chemicals into the lake, right?" She hesitated. "Well, I wouldn't put it that way, but yes, it's part of a new project. Very safe, very controlled. It'll be great for the community." "Great for the community?" I echoed. I wasn't sure if I was going to laugh or scream at the absurdity of it all. "You're dumping chemicals in the lake. My kids swim there. What the hell is going on?" "Oh, it's perfectly fine," she said, now sounding defensive. "This is all for the betterment of the environment, trust me. It's all being handled by licensed professionals." She hung up before I could say anything else. I stared at the phone for a second, dumbfounded. The audacity. Who did she think she was fooling? The HOA couldn't just dump chemicals into a lake like that and expect me to believe it was all for the betterment of the environment. This wasn't some peaceful little cleanup project. This was a disaster waiting to happen. I didn't know what to do next. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Call the cops? The local authorities were probably in on it. This was the HOA we were talking about. They ran this neighborhood like a dictatorship. But that didn't stop me from thinking about my options. I couldn't just sit back and watch as they destroyed the lake. My lake. The place I went to escape, to relax, to breathe. They couldn't get away with it. I needed to take action, but how? For a few days, I watched from a distance. The trucks kept coming and the chemical smell grew stronger. More barrels, more men in suits. It felt like the HOA was ramping up their operation and no one was saying anything. Nobody was doing anything. I started to ask around. Mrs. Thompson, the old lady who lived 2 houses down, looked nervous when I mentioned the lake. She practically whispered when she said, "Oh, they've been doing that for weeks now. The HOA been in charge of this project. You didn't hear about it." "I heard something about it," I said, narrowing my eyes. "But nobody bothered to mention what they were actually doing." She shook her head. I don't think it's good, Alex. I've seen things, strange things, but you didn't hear it from me. I could tell she was scared, and that made me scared. What the hell was going on here? That was it. I'd had enough. I knew I couldn't just sit there hoping it would magically fix itself. So I did what any person in their right mind would do when confronted with an HOA gone rogue. I decided to start digging. I spent the next few days researching the chemicals I'd seen on the barrels. I wanted to know exactly what kind of nightmare I was dealing with. What were they dumping in my lake? Was it dangerous? Was it legal? It didn't take long to find out the truth. The chemicals were toxic, dangerous. The lake wasn't just going to be ruined, it would be poisoned for years to come. I was furious but also determined. I wasn't going to let the HOA get away with this. They had to be stopped. But how? How could I take on an entire HOA? I had an idea. It wasn't going to be easy. I'd have to be smart. I'd have to gather evidence, get the right authorities involved. And most importantly, I had to make sure the HOA couldn't weasel their way out of it. I started to gather all the proof I could. Pictures, videos, notes, everything. I was going to make sure they couldn't deny what they had done. I wasn't going to let this stand. I wasn't going to let them ruin my lake, my community. I was going to take them down. And the first step, I was going to send the EPA to their doorstep. It was time to get serious. I've always been the type to take matters into my own hands. But this was something I never thought I'd have to deal with. Who in their right mind dumps toxic chemicals into a lake like it's nothing? It's not like I'd gone looking for trouble, I just wanted to enjoy the lake, the calm waters, the sound of the wind in the trees. Instead, I found myself standing at the edge of a disaster, staring at barrels of toxic waste. I spent the next few days quietly gathering evidence. Every time I passed the lake, I'd take more photos. Every time a truck showed up, I'd take another video. I documented everything, the barrels, the men in the suits, the strange chemical smells that now seemed to hang in the air. There was no way the HOA could deny this. They were caught red-handed. I wasn't sure what to do with all the evidence. Part of me wanted to just call the authorities right then and there, but the other part of me, well, that part knew better. I'd heard stories about the HOA before. They had their hands in everything. They had the local cops in their back pocket, and they weren't afraid to use their influence. If I just called them up, there was a good chance they'd make me out to be the troublemaker, the crazy neighbor who didn't understand what the HOA was really doing. No, I needed something bigger. I needed a bombshell, something so undeniable that even the HOA couldn't spin it into something pretty. And that's when I decided to go all in. I didn't know much about environmental law, but I knew one thing for sure. If something was poisoning the lake, the EPA had to be involved. The Environmental Protection Agency, the big guns. If anyone could take the HOA down, it was them. But I needed to be smart about it. I couldn't just call them up and say, hey, the HOA is poisoning the lake. No, I needed a plan. I needed proof. So I spent hours researching everything about the chemicals I'd found. What were they? Where did they come from? What could they do to the environment? I needed to be armed with all the facts. I started with the labels on the barrels. Corrosive, toxic, hazardous waste. Pretty clear signs that whatever the HOA was up to, it wasn't good. I Googled every chemical I could read on the labels. The more I dug, the worse it got. These weren't just some harmless cleaning supplies. These chemicals were nasty, the kind of stuff that could kill fish, ruin the ecosystem, and make the lake unsafe for anyone who dared to swim in it. I was getting angrier by the minute, but I knew I couldn't let that anger cloud my judgment. I needed to be methodical. I needed to play this game by the rules, even if the HOA wasn't. So I took notes, wrote down the chemical names, and printed out research papers on the environmental impact of those substances. I wanted to make sure that when I called the EPA, they would take me seriously. It was a Saturday morning when I made the call. I woke up early, the sun barely rising, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at all the evidence I'd gathered. The stacks of photos, the printouts of research, the video footage on my phone. I was ready. I dialed the number for the EPA. My heart was pounding as I waited for someone to pick up. After what felt like forever, a voice on the other end said, "EPA, how can I help you?" I swallowed. Here it was. "Hi, my name's Alex, and I live in the Silver Lake community. I need to report an environmental violation. The local homeowners association is dumping toxic chemicals into our lake." There was a pause, followed by the sound of typing. "Can you provide details? What kind of chemicals are being dumped? Do you have evidence?" I hesitated. "Yes, I've got photos, video footage, and I've done some research on the chemicals. They're highly toxic and corrosive. They could harm the lake's ecosystem and make it unsafe for anyone living here, especially for kids who swim there. All right, we'll need all that evidence. Please email it over to us and we'll start an investigation. I gave them my contact info and hung up the phone, feeling a rush of adrenaline. I had done it. I had taken the first step in exposing the HOA's dirty little secret. Next few days were a blur. I spent hours organizing all the materials I'd gathered. I didn't want to miss anything, not a single detail. The last thing I wanted was for the EPA to think I was exaggerating. This had to be airtight. I sent everything off to the EPA, along with a detailed email outlining the timeline of events and what I had seen. I also mentioned the peculiar way the HOA had been acting, the strange meetings, the trucks that had been showing up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure if that part would be useful, but it felt important. And then I waited. It wasn't long before the EPA called back. The woman on the other end of the line sounded serious, which was a good sign. "We've reviewed your evidence," she said. "We're opening an investigation. This is a serious matter. We'll be in touch with the HOA." I felt like I could breathe again. I'd done it. The HOA was about to get hit with the kind of investigation they couldn't sweep under the rug, but I wasn't done yet. I needed to stay on top of things, make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. That afternoon, I took another walk by the lake, hoping to see some signs of the EPA showing up. Instead, I was greeted by something far worse. The trucks were back, and this time they were unloading something even more alarming. Large containers of liquid, a deep green color, were being poured into the lake. This wasn't just chemicals in barrels anymore. This was an all-out assault on the water. I snapped photos as quickly as I could, trying not to get too close, just in case whatever they were dumping was even worse than what I'd originally seen. The air smelled worse than ever. It was thick, like burnt rubber and chemicals. I could feel my stomach twist in knots. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that they were still dumping, or the realization that the HOA was either so bold or so stupid that they didn't care if anyone saw them anymore. I couldn't let this slide, not now. I quickly sent the new photos to the EPA, my hands shaking as I typed out the message. "This is getting worse. They're dumping more chemicals into the lake, and it looks like they're doing it in broad daylight. Please hurry." The reply came almost immediately. "Thank you for the update. We're sending a team out there as soon as possible. We'll keep you informed." I thought about going over there and confronting the workers, but I knew that wouldn't do any good. The HOA had its own hired goons who'd probably try to intimidate me or worse. No, this had to be handled by the experts. But deep down, I knew something was coming. I knew this wasn't just going to be a simple cleanup. The HOA was going to fight back, and they were going to fight dirty. But the thing was, I had already won. The EPA was on their way. They couldn't hide anymore. It wasn't over yet, but I was getting closer. And I was done waiting for them to destroy what was mine. The next few days were some of the longest I'd ever experienced. I'd handed over all the evidence to the EPA, and they had responded with the kind of professionalism that gave me a glimmer of hope. They were taking this seriously. They were going to investigate. I just had to wait for them to do their thing. But the waiting, it was killing me. I spent my days packing around the house, checking my phone every few minutes, hopping for an update. I'd take a walk by the lake now and then to see if the trucks were still showing up, but each time they were gone. No trucks, no workers. The lake, though still tainted with chemicals, was eerily quiet. It felt like the calm before the storm. But in those silent days, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The HOA had been quiet too quiet. It was almost as if they were pretending nothing was happening. I started to wonder if they'd been tipped off about the investigation. I didn't put it past them. The HOA had connections, I knew that much. They had their fingers in a lot of pies around here, the local government, the law enforcement, and even the schools. They didn't just control this neighborhood, they practically owned it. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the lake through the window when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the EPA. I nearly dropped the phone in my rush to open it. "Hello, Alex. Thank you again for providing the evidence. We are currently in the process of reviewing the situation. Our team will be conducting an on-site inspection this week. We will notify you of any updates. Please continue to document any unusual activity." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Finally, they were coming, but a part of me worried it might be too late. What if the HOA had already covered their tracks? What if they'd moved the chemicals, or worse, hidden them? I wasn't naive enough to think they'd just roll over and admit defeat. No, they were going to fight, and when the HOA fought, they played dirty. For the next few days, I kept my distance from the lake, determined not to raise any suspicion. If the HOA thought I was watching them, they might go into overdrive, trying to cover up their mess even more. I spent my time watching the lake from my window, checking for any signs of the trucks or workers, but mostly I kept my focus on the bigger picture, the investigation. The EPA was going to come, and when they did, the HOA wouldn't be able to wiggle out of this one. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. One afternoon, just as I was finishing a long, stressful call with my lawyer, who had graciously agreed to help me figure out what to do next, I heard a car pull up outside. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind that screamed important. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. I didn't recognize him at first, but then he turned and smiled, that smile, the kind of grin that didn't reach his eyes. I knew instantly who he was. It was Mr. Higgins, the HOA president. I had been expecting him to show up eventually, but not like this. The man had a reputation for being smooth, calculating, and above all, arrogant. He was the type who didn't just run the HOA, he owned it. He controlled everything from the landscaping companies to the security patrols. And now here he was, strolling across my lawn like he owned the whole neighborhood. I froze for a second, my heart racing. I couldn't believe it. He was here right outside my door. The HOA was making its move. I grabbed my phone and as casually as I could opened the camera app. I needed evidence. If this was going to get messy, I needed to be prepared. I snapped a few pictures of him walking up my driveway, then quickly slipped the phone into my pocket. I went to the door, took a deep breath, and opened it. Mr. Higgins stood there, looking at me with that smug grin plastered on his face. "Alex," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I was hoping we could have a little chat." "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Inside, my heart was pounding. I knew this wasn't just a friendly visit. He smiled again, a little too wide this time. "About the lake, about the situation." I didn't invite him in, but he didn't seem to care. He just walked right past me, making himself at home. He glanced around my living room, his eyes scanning the walls, as if assessing how much money I had or how much sway I held in the neighborhood. It made me feel uncomfortable, but I didn't show it. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me. "I assume you've heard about the recent concerns with the lake," Mr. Higgins continued, settling into an armchair like he owned it. "I wanted to clear things up. There's no need for all this drama, Alex." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. "I think the only drama here is the fact that you're dumping chemicals into the lake, Mr. Higgins." He chuckled, the sound cold and rehearsed. "Oh, I see. You've been talking to people, maybe even spreading rumors. It's all overblown, Alex. Nothing to worry about. A few minor adjustments, that's all. The lake, going to be better than ever." I couldn't believe my ears. He was standing there in my living room, acting like everything was normal, like he wasn't responsible for poisoning the lake. He was trying to play me, trying to downplay the entire situation. "Better than ever," I repeated, a little louder than I meant to. "You're dumping toxic waste into the water. My kids swim there. That's not better. That's a disaster waiting to happen." Mr. Higgins's smile faded for a moment, but only for a moment. "Alex, let's not do this. I think you're being a little dramatic. The HOA's always been good to you, hasn't it? You've enjoyed living here, haven't you?" I nodded, but my mind was racing. Of course, I'd enjoyed living here. Who would? The HOA had made sure the grass was green, the streets were clean, and the neighborhood looked like a model for suburban perfection. But all of that was built on a lie that was poisoning the very thing I loved most about this place, the lake. "Mr. Higgins, I know what you're doing," I said, my voice steady. "And it's not going to work. I've already called the EPA. They're coming. This isn't just a minor adjustment. It's illegal, and you're going to pay for it." His eyes narrowed and the smug smile slowly disappeared. "The EPA?" he repeated, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Alex, you really think they'll do anything? This is a well-established project. You're wasting your time." I didn't flinch. "The EPA has all the evidence they need. You're done." There was a long, tense silence. I could feel the power shift in the room. Mr. Higgins was no longer the calm, confident HOA president. He was a man caught in a lie, trying to hold on to whatever power he had left. He stood up abruptly, adjusting his suit jacket. "I think we're done here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you've made a mistake, Alex, big mistake." With that, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The calm before the storm was over. This wasn't just about the lake anymore, it was war, and I was ready. The EPA was coming, and I wasn't backing down. It was game on. It was late afternoon when the call came. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts, and I immediately recognized the number. It was the EPA. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. Hello. Hi, Alex, this is Rachel from the EPA. We've reviewed the materials you sent us and we're moving forward with an investigation. Our team is on their way to your neighborhood right now. We'll be there shortly. The words hit me like a wave. I had been expecting this, sure, but hearing it confirmed sent a rush of adrenaline through my veins. It was really happening. The EPA was finally going to confront the HOA. They were coming to clean up the mess, to hold these people accountable. I wasn't alone anymore. I quickly asked for more details, who would be coming, when, and what to expect. Rachel was calm, reassuring, and professional, which helped ease my nerves. The EPA team would arrive in about an hour. They'd meet with me first, then go straight to the lake to investigate. I had done everything I could to prepare, but now I had to wait. I stood by the window, staring out at the lake, wondering how much damage the HOA had done already. The chemicals were still there, I was sure of it. I could almost smell the toxic stench in the air. The idea that someone could do this, poison a beautiful lake for profit or convenience, made my blood boil. As I waited, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Mr. Higgins earlier. I hadn't expected him to show up at my door like that. He had been calm, too calm, like he thought he could talk his way out of anything. But I could see the cracks. He was nervous. I'd rattled him. The HOA might have all the money and power, but they couldn't erase the truth. Not this time. And not while I had the EPA on my side. About 45 minutes later, I saw the first EPA car pull up. It was a white van with Environmental Protection Agency written on the side. The team was here. My pulse quickened. I threw on a jacket and walked outside to greet them. 3 people got out, 2 men, 1 woman. The woman, Rachel, was the first to approach me. She was tall, with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense look about her. The 2 men behind her were both in their mid-30s, wearing navy blue jackets with the EPA logo on them. All 3 of them looked ready to get to work. I immediately felt a sense of relief. These were professionals, people who knew exactly what they were doing. Alex, Rachel asked as she extended her hand. Thanks for meeting us. We're here to take a look at the lake, and then we'll start the investigation. I shook her hand, trying to stay calm, though I could feel the weight of the moment. I've been waiting for this. You have everything you need, right? I've got photos, videos, and everything I could gather. Rachel smiled briefly, but her expression was all business. We've reviewed your evidence, but we need to see it for ourselves. Let's head to the lake. We walked down the path to the lake, and as we got closer, I could already see the damage. The water was darker than it should have been, and there was a noticeable sheen on the surface. The air still smelled faintly of chemicals. My stomach churned as I saw the barrels lined up near the edge, partially hidden by the bushes. The sight of it all made my blood boil all over again. This is it, I said, pointing to the barrels. They've been dumping chemicals in the lake for weeks. I don't know how much damage it's caused yet, but I'm sure it's a lot. Rachel nodded, and she immediately began taking notes. One of the men, whose name I later learned was Tom, pulled out a small handheld device and started testing the water. The other man, Mark, began taking photographs of the barrels and the surrounding area. For a few minutes, I stood back and watched them work. It was strange to see the situation through their eyes, their focus, their professionalism. They were here to do their job, to make sure the lake was safe again, and I could feel the weight of their authority. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about making sure something like this never happened again. I watched as Rachel crouched down by the barrels, inspecting the labels. These are definitely hazardous materials, she said, more to herself than anyone else. They've been dumping all kinds of toxic substances here. Tom, still testing the water, confirmed her suspicion. The pH levels are off the charts, he muttered, tapping on his device. Whatever they're dumping, it's not safe. We need to get samples and report this. I felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief because I wasn't crazy, the EPA could see the damage clearly. But also anger because I knew the HOA was going to try to wriggle their way out of this. They always did. And Mr. Higgins? I wasn't sure how much more of his fake politeness I could stomach. As Rachel and Tom continued to work, I noticed movement at the edge of the lake. My stomach twisted. It was a group of HOA workers. They were coming straight toward us, and they weren't walking casually. They were marching like they had a point to prove, and I knew exactly who was leading them. It was Mr. Higgins. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, but I didn't show it. I was about to watch the showdown unfold. This was it. The EPA had arrived, and the HOA wasn't going to be able to talk their way out of this. Higgins made his way toward me with his usual smug grin, but this time it didn't sit right. The arrogance in his eyes was different. He wasn't as calm as he had been at my house. The situation was slipping out of his control, and he knew it. "Alex," he said, his voice smooth but tight, "I see the EPA's come to join the party." Rachel didn't even look up from the water test she was conducting. "We're here to investigate," she said, her tone neutral but firm. "It's a little late for you to be concerned about the lake." Higgins's grin faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered. "I don't think you understand. This is all part of a larger project. The HOA has been working with contractors to improve the lake. What you're seeing is part of an initiative to clean up the water, to make it safer for everyone." It was laughable. I wanted to laugh out loud, but I held it in. Instead, I crossed my arms, meeting his gaze. "You're poisoning the lake, Higgins. You're lying. You can't cover it up anymore." Rachel, now standing up and brushing dirt off her knees, looked at him with a cold, calculating stare. "We're going to need to review all your documentation for this initiative. If this is a legitimate project, you'll have no problem providing the records. Otherwise, you'll be looking at some very serious charges." Higgins's smile was gone. The man was visibly sweating now. His calm facade was cracking, and I could see the panic starting to creep into his eyes. He was a cornered animal, and I knew it. "You don't understand," he muttered. "This is bigger than you, bigger than the EPA. You're making a mistake." I stepped forward, unable to stop myself. "You're the one who's made a mistake, Higgins. You thought you could get away with poisoning the lake. You thought you could intimidate me into backing off. Well, guess what? You're not getting away with it." Tom, still snapping pictures, spoke up. "You need to leave now. We're collecting evidence, and you're obstructing an official investigation." For the first time, I saw genuine fear flicker across Higgins's face. He looked at Rachel, then at the team, and then back at me like he was trying to calculate his next move. But it was too late for that. The EPA was already in motion, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Without another word, Higgins turned and stormed off, his workers trailing behind him. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today the HOA had lost. The EPA team continued their work, and I stood back, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. The HOA had underestimated me. They had underestimated the power of truth and the persistence of someone who refused to back down. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The next few days were filled with a lot of waiting and a lot of watching. I kept my eyes glued to the lake, still filled with toxic barrels and chemical residue. I knew the EPA had to act quickly, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a little nervous. What if the HOA had already started covering their tracks? What if they were just waiting for the dust to settle before sweeping everything under the rug? I didn't trust them, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I spent my time digging into everything I could find on the HOA, the contractors they'd hired, and the improvements they were claiming to make. I dug through local news reports, scoured town hall meeting notes, and even spoke to a few neighbors who'd been around for a while. I needed to know who I was up against. And let me tell you, the more I learned about the HOA, the more disgusted I became. They had their fingers in every pie in this town, and they were used to getting their way. The more I found out, the more determined I became. I wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore. This had turned into something bigger. I was fighting for my neighborhood. I was fighting for the people who lived here, who had no idea the kind of people they were dealing with. The HOA didn't just control our lake. They controlled our lives. But the real game changer came one evening when I got a message from Rachel at the EPA. The tone of the email was as professional as ever, but something about it felt different. There was an urgency to it that hadn't been there before. "Alex, we've reviewed the water samples. The situation is more serious than we thought. We need to meet with you tomorrow morning. We'll discuss next steps, but the HOA has already started damage control. They're not going to sit idly by." That was it. They weren't just cleaning up anymore. They were scrambling to make sure this didn't get out of hand. The HOA had made a mistake, and now they were going to try everything in their power to cover it up. I could feel the tension in my chest, but I was ready. I knew this wasn't going to be a quick fight, and I knew the HOA was about to get a lot more aggressive. But I wasn't backing down. I couldn't. The next morning, I met Rachel and the team at the local diner. The atmosphere was tense, but Rachel was calm. She walked me through the findings in detail. The chemicals the HOA had dumped into the lake weren't just harmful, they were deadly. The water was contaminated with industrial-grade solvents, chemicals that could not only kill fish and plants, but also make the entire ecosystem uninhabitable for years. "The situation is serious, Alex," Rachel said, sipping her coffee. "We've already started the paperwork for an official investigation. The EPA is going to hold the HOA accountable for this, but we need to get more evidence. We need to ensure they can't just clean this up and pretend it didn't happen." I nodded, feeling a surge of hope mixed with anger. This wasn't just a community problem anymore. This was a public health issue, and the HOA was at the center of it all. "We've already spoken to a few of their contractors," Rachel continued, "and they've been less than cooperative, but we've got enough to make a case. However, there's something you need to know. The HOA has gotten wind of the investigation, and they're trying to cover their tracks. We've already seen them pull some suspicious moves." My stomach tightened. I knew it. I had sensed something was off. "They're making it harder for us to get full access to the site," Rachel said. "They're even trying to intimidate witnesses. It's only going to get uglier from here." I wasn't surprised. The HOA wasn't the kind of group that just rolled over. But they'd made a mistake by underestimating me, by underestimating the power of the truth. "I don't care how ugly it gets," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not backing down. They can try all they want, but they won't win." Rachel smiled a little. "That's what I like to hear. The truth has a way of coming out no matter how hard they try to bury it." We spent the next hour discussing strategy. Rachel laid out a plan for the next steps. The EPA would continue collecting evidence, gather more water samples, and start pulling records from the contractors who had worked with the HOA. But we both knew that we were about to enter the most dangerous phase of this fight. The HOA would fight back with everything they had. As I left the diner, I felt a sense of determination burning inside me. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this was the point where everything changed. The HOA had thought they could intimidate me, bully me into silence. But now, with the EPA involved, they were the ones who were going to feel the heat. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk by the lake again just to check if anything had changed. To my surprise, there were no trucks, no workers. The place was silent. But there was something else. The water looked different. The sheen was gone, and the surface of the lake seemed almost normal again. I didn't trust it, not for a second. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, just in case. The last thing I needed was for them to clean up the evidence when they thought no one was looking. I knew the HOA was capable of anything at this point. That evening, I got another email. This one was from a local news outlet. It was a short message, but it sent chills down my spine. "We've heard rumors about what's happening with the lake. We'd like to speak with you. This could be big." I didn't hesitate for a second. The HOA had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but this was my chance to make sure everyone knew what was happening. I didn't care how much they tried to intimidate me. This was about the truth, and if the media could help me get that truth out, then I was all in. I agreed to meet with the reporter the next morning. We met in a small park near the lake, and as soon as I began speaking, I could see the shock on her face. I told her everything about the chemicals, the barrels, the shady deals with the contractors, and the HOA's lies. I showed her the photos, the videos, and everything I had gathered. The reporter asked a lot of questions, most of them making me angry all over again. But I stayed calm. This was my chance to make the HOA pay for what they had done. The reporter promised to run the story, but she also warned me that it might not be easy. The HOA had a lot of influence, they had connections, and they wouldn't hesitate to try to shut the story down. I wasn't scared. The HOA could try to bury the truth all they wanted, but it was out there now. The media was involved, and so was the EPA. The truth couldn't be hidden anymore. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about the HOA's next move, about what they might do to try and stop this. But I knew one thing for sure: I was ready. I wasn't backing down, and the truth was on my side. The next day, the story hit the local news. It spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, it was all anyone could talk about. People in the community were shocked, furious. They couldn't believe what had been happening right under their noses. The HOA's improvements weren't just a scam. They were poisoning the very thing that made this community worth living in. And then the HOA did exactly what I knew they would do. they panicked. The first sign came in the form of a phone call from Mr. Higgins himself. His voice was tight, angry. "You've made a huge mistake, Alex," he snarled. "This isn't over. We'll make sure you regret this." I laughed. "You should have thought of that before you started dumping chemicals in the lake, Higgins. It's too late. The truth is out. You can't stop it now." He hung up, but I knew it was far from over. The HOA wasn't done yet, but they were getting desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. And that's when I knew the battle had only just begun, but I was going to win. I wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, every local news outlet was buzzing about the scandal. The story was everywhere, online, on TV, and even in the local paper. The HOA, which had once been the untouchable titan of our community, was suddenly the villain. And I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction, but I knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. I was still packing around the house, trying to process what had happened, when my phone buzzed. The message was from Rachel at the EPA. I quickly opened it. "Alex, we've received confirmation that the HOA is trying to do damage control. They've contacted some of the local businesses, trying to influence them. We need to move quickly. We've got the legal framework in place, but we need to secure evidence from a few more sources. I'll keep you updated." My heart sank a little. Of course, the HOA would try to stop it. They weren't just going to sit there and let the truth ruin everything they had built. But I wasn't scared. I had made it this far, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me now. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the phone for a moment, my thoughts swirling. They were still out there, trying to put out the fire I had started. The HOA was used to getting their way, but now the community knew what they had done, and I wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug. But as much as I was ready to fight, I had to admit that something had shifted. The game was different now. The battle wasn't just about the lake anymore. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. That afternoon, as I walked to the mailbox to grab the mail, I was greeted by an unexpected sight. Mrs. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, standing at the end of her driveway, arms folded, looking determined. I walked over, curious. "I saw the news, Alex," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not standing by and letting that HOA bully us anymore. It's time we did something about it." I was stunned. Mrs. Thompson, the sweet old lady who always baked cookies and brought them over on holidays, was furious, and I couldn't blame her. Everyone was furious. The lake, the heart of our community, was poisoned, and the people responsible were trying to act like nothing had happened. "We're not the only ones hooray angry, you know," she continued, glancing around. "The whole neighborhood is talking. The word's getting out, and people want to make sure this never happens again." She wasn't kidding. As I walked back to my house, I saw people in their front yards talking in hushed tones, pointing toward the lake, shaking their heads in disbelief. They'd known something was wrong, but had been too intimidated by the HOA to speak up. But now people were fired up. The news had ignited something in them, something that had been buried under years of HOA control. The truth had come to light, and now people weren't afraid to stand up. The tide had turned. The following day, I got a call from Mark, one of the EPA agents who had been working with Rachel. His voice was serious. "Alex, we need to talk. The HOA's not giving up. We've been trying to get full access to their records, and they're stonewalling us. But here's the thing, we've got a few leads on other contractors who were involved in their cleanup efforts. Some of them are ready to talk. They want to help, but they're scared of retaliation." I felt a pit in my stomach. The HOA was going to fight dirty, I knew it. But we were gaining ground. People were coming forward. The walls the HOA had built around themselves were starting to crack. "I'm going to set up a meeting with one of the contractors tomorrow," Mark said. "We need to get to the bottom of this, and fast." "Got it," I replied, my resolve hardening. "Let me know what I can do." I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not now, not after everything I'd been through. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and visits from concerned neighbors. People were rallying together, ready to take action. Mrs. Thompson organized a neighborhood meeting, and word spread fast. The community was buzzing with anger and determination. Everyone was talking about the lake, the chemicals, the lies. They were all ready to fight back. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. It was a Friday afternoon when I received another email from Rachel at the EPA. The subject line read, "Urgent HOA response." I clicked it open, heart pounding. "Alex, we've secured the documents we need. We're filing charges against the HOA for illegal disposal of hazardous waste. We've got the contractor's testimonies, and we have enough evidence to make a case. We're going to press forward with a public hearing next week. The HOA's hold on this town is over." I stared at the screen for a moment, taking in the words, my breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the moment I had worked for. The fight wasn't over, but the victory was within reach. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The community came together like never before. People started showing up at the local town hall meetings, demanding accountability from the HOA. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before suddenly became my allies, all of us united in the goal of protecting the lake and the community we loved. And the HOA? They tried everything to stop it. They hired high-priced lawyers, they tried to discredit the witnesses, and they attempted to bury the story in the media. But it didn't work. The truth had a way of spreading faster than their lies. Finally, the day of the public hearing arrived. The atmosphere at Town Hall was electric. The room was packed with people, residents, reporters, environmentalists, even local government officials. Everyone was there to witness what could be the downfall of the HOA. It was impossible to ignore the tension in the air. Rachel and the EPA team presented their findings first. The evidence was damning. They showed photos of the toxic chemicals, detailed the damage to the lake, and explained how the HOA had knowingly violated environmental laws. The contractors who had worked with the HOA testified about the pressure they'd been under to cover up the truth. One of them even admitted that they'd been paid to dump the chemicals, despite knowing the risks. I couldn't help but watch Mr. Higgins as he sat at the front of the room, his face pale, his hands trembling. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. Now he was just a man caught in his lies, watching as his empire crumbled. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front, my heart pounding, but I kept my head high. I told my story about discovering the barrels, about the lies the HOA had told, about the people who had tried to intimidate me into staying quiet. I spoke about the community, about how we had all been manipulated and controlled for too long. And I ended with a message for everyone in that room. This was not just about a lake. It was about standing up to corruption. It was about holding people accountable. By the time I finished, the room was silent. I could feel the weight of every person in that room on me, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was on my side, and it was stronger than anything the HOA could throw at us. The hearing ended with a decision. The HOA was fined, the board members were forced to step down, and the funds they had once used to manipulate the community were redirected to cleaning up the lake and restoring the ecosystem. It wasn't the complete dismantling of the HOA that I had hoped for, but it was a start, and it felt like a victory. As I walked out of the town hall, my neighbors gathered around me, clapping me on the back, shaking my hand. Mrs. Thompson even gave me a hug. "You did it, Alex," she said, tears in her eyes. "You brought us together, you brought the truth to light, we all owe you." And in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't just about me. This was about all of us. It wasn't just about the lake. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how powerful the enemy seemed. As I looked at the lake, still marred by the damage the HOA had caused, I knew this wasn't the end. The fight had been long and hard, but we had won. And I wasn't going to stop fighting for this community. Not now, not ever. The HOA had tried to bury the truth, but in the end, truth always rises, always. And that was the sweetest payback of all. The days after the hearing felt surreal. It was like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders, but at the same time, everything had changed. Our neighborhood was no longer the quiet, peaceful place I'd always known. No, now it was a place of victory, a place of empowerment. We had fought back against the HOA, against the corruption that had poisoned not just the lake, but the entire spirit of our community. And we had won. But the work wasn't over yet. I remember the first time I went down to the lake after the hearing. The chemicals had already started to clear, but the damage was still visible. The water wasn't as clear as it used to be, and the fish had yet to return in full. The restoration process would take time, a long time, but the important thing was that we had started the journey toward healing. The lake had been saved. We had saved it. As I stood by the water, I thought back to how this whole mess started. The small discovery of barrels by the lake had felt like nothing at the time. I never imagined it would turn into something so big. I just wanted to protect the lake, but along the way, I'd ended up protecting my whole neighborhood. People had come together in a way I hadn't thought possible. They stepped up, not just for the lake, but for each other. It was almost like I had woken up a sleeping giant. And once people realized the truth, they couldn't go back to ignoring the HOA's stranglehold on the community. People talked to each other more, shared information, and stood up when the HOA tried to get away with things. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of unity. We were no longer just residents of a neighborhood. We were a community, a real one. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. After the hearing, the HOA didn't just go quietly. They fought back in their own way. They tried to appeal the decision, claiming that the fines were too harsh. They tried to turn the media against us, but at this point, no one was buying their lies anymore. The damage to their reputation was done. People knew who they were, and they weren't going to let them control things any longer. It was almost amusing watching them squirm. They'd spent years building this image of perfection, of being the guardians of the neighborhood, the ones who made sure everything was pristine and proper. But when the truth came out, that image shattered. People saw them for what they really were, a group of power-hungry individuals who didn't care about the community, only about their control. They didn't care about the lake. They didn't care about us. They cared about money, and they would do anything to keep it. Mr. Higgins, in particular, became a punchline. He couldn't walk down the street without someone whispering behind his back or giving him a cold stare. I couldn't say I felt bad for him. He'd had every chance to do the right thing. But he'd chosen greed. He'd chosen to poison the very thing that brought us together. That was something he couldn't come back from. And I wasn't about to let him forget it. But the most satisfying part, the part that made everything worth it was watching the community take back control. It wasn't just about the lake anymore. People had learned that they had a voice. They had power. The HOA had tried to tear us apart, but in the end, it only made us stronger. I remember the day we had our first real community meeting after the hearing. It wasn't some HOA-controlled event where people were too scared to speak up. This time, people showed up, and they spoke their minds. They shared their concerns about the future of the neighborhood. They talked about making sure something like the lake incident never happened again. They talked about holding the HOA accountable and making sure they never got that much power again. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. People were awake now. They were engaged. The silent majority had found their voice, and they weren't going to be silent anymore. Mrs. Thompson, who had been one of the first people to back me up, was there, of course. She stood up in front of the group, her voice steady but passionate. "We've let them control us for too long," she said, looking out at the group. "This lake was the heart of our community, and they nearly destroyed it, but they didn't. We did. We stood up. And now it's time for us to make sure they never have the power to do that again." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, I truly felt like I wasn't alone in this. The neighborhood had come together, and now we were unstoppable. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing new rules for the neighborhood. We talked about forming a new residents' association, one that was transparent, accountable, and focused on the well-being of the community. People volunteered to help with everything, from organizing neighborhood events to setting up a committee that would keep an eye on local businesses and developers. No one was going to have unchecked power in this town again, not on our watch. By the end of the meeting, I could see the change in people. They were no longer afraid of standing up for what was right. They were no longer afraid of what the HOA might do to them. They'd seen the power of unity. They'd seen how standing together could move mountains. A week later, the HOA board members officially resigned. They had no choice. The pressure was too much. The media wouldn't leave them alone, and the community had completely turned on them. They couldn't even hold a board meeting without people showing up to demand answers. The new Residents Association was up and running within a month. People were excited about the changes, excited about the possibility of a neighborhood that worked for everyone, not just the few who held all the power. We were building something better, something real. The lake, of course, was the symbol of our victory. It wasn't perfect yet, but the cleanup was well underway. The EPA had returned to oversee the process, and contractors were hired to restore the ecosystem. Fish were slowly coming back, and the plants that had once been suffocated by chemicals were starting to grow again. It would take time, but it was healing. As I sat by the lake one afternoon, watching the ripples on the water, I realized just how far we'd come. It wasn't just about saving the lake anymore. It was about saving the soul of our community. We had faced a villain, and we had won. We had taken back what was ours. And it wasn't just about the victory over the HOA either. It was about something bigger. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how hard it seems. It was about the realization that we, the people, had the power to make change. We didn't have to sit by and watch while others took what belonged to us. We could fight, and we could win. The road hadn't been easy. There had been moments when I felt like giving up. There had been times when I thought the HOA would win, that the truth would be buried forever. But I didn't give up, and neither did the people around me. We fought and we kept fighting because we knew that the truth was worth it. I looked around at the lake, the water now clear and peaceful, and I smiled. We had done this. We had saved it, and in the process, we had saved each other. Never let anyone tell you that you can't make a difference. Never let anyone convince you that you're too small to fight back. Because when you stand up for what's right, when you stand together with others who believe in the same thing, you can change the world. And trust me, there's nothing more powerful than that. We had won, and I couldn't be prouder.